Hey guys, LevelCap here. Today I would like to talk about frames per second, also known as FPS, when it applies to video games. Now in this video I would like to provide you guys with some of the basic information about FPS, why we have the standards that we do, whether or not more is better, and I also want to clear up some of the common misconceptions about frame rate and what the human eye can actually see. Now the first time anybody ever had to deal with frame rate was in the silent film era, and in this time there wasn't actually a standard for what speed to play films at. You could basically hand crank them. There would also be different projectors that could run at different speeds, anywhere from around 16 frames per second to about 24 frames per second, sometimes a little bit faster depending on what you were watching it on. But it wasn't until around the 1930s that they actually started to standardize the frame rate to around 24 frames per second because they were integrating sound to the 35mm film. So if you sped it up too fast, the sound wouldn't sound proper, so they actually had to come up with standards for everybody to use. Now, why was 24 frames per second chosen? Well, it actually had a little bit to do with Thomas Edison, who did some research at the time and concluded that if the human eye saw any less than 46 images per second, it would actually cause some pretty serious eye strain. So what they did is they filmed things at 24 frames per second but displayed each image twice, so effectively you're seeing 48 images a second but only 24 different images. This is actually very similar to what you would experience while playing on, say, an Xbox or a PlayStation on your TV. The TV refreshes at 60 frames per second, so you can actually see 60 images, but the console might be playing a game that only refreshes at 30 images per second, so you're going to see each image twice. It's the same concept, just many years later in video game format. Now, a common myth that has come out of this frame rate standard is that the human eye cannot see beyond 24 frames per second, or sometimes you'll hear that the human eye cannot see beyond 30 frames per second. This is just not true. In fact, there's been some actual tests conducted by the US Air Force where they flashed an image on screen for 1/220th of a second. Now this was for pilots to try and identify different types of aircraft, and they were able to do so successfully at 1/220th of a second. So that's effectively at a frame rate of 220 frames per second, pilots were able to distinguish specific aircraft. So we know the human eye is capable of picking up light in that small of increments. This is not to say that 220 frames per second is the fastest frame rate that the human eye can pick up. It's just what the Air Force had tested at the time. In fact, there's a lot of theoretical science out there to suggest that the human eye can pick up much faster, or rather much shorter increments of light. So if the human eye can see so many frames per second, why did we choose such a low frame rate? Well, if you think about it, back in the day, film costs money. If you were to shoot film at 100 frames per second, you're effectively going to be increasing the cost of your film 4 times for that movie. So 24 frames per second at the time was the minimum, also that you could display somewhat fluid motion. Now, cameras were not mounted to people's heads back in the day, so you weren't whipping your head around and creating jarring, distorting effects. It was mostly just still cameras, slow dolly shots, things where 24 frames per second was more than enough. We fast forward quite a while and we're playing video games where what we're seeing is supposed to be a representation of a person running through an action scene. Now when you're whipping your head around and looking around you in 180 degrees or doing full 360s, 24 frames per second doesn't really cut it. Now 30 has become the standard for television, so a lot of video games still play at 30 frames per second. And the games are certainly enjoyable at 30 FPS, but what happens if we actually increase this frame rate to, say, 60? We double that effective frame rate. You might be thinking, why are we going all the way up to 60? What if we just increase it a little bit to 40? Well, the reason why they chose 60 is because if your TV refreshes at 60 hertz, well, then you can still display 60 images perfectly. If you choose something like 40 images, well, that doesn't divide into 60 perfectly, and you get what's called screen tearing. This actually happens on computers when you turn off VSync when you're playing video games. games. You will see a lot of screen tearing, and the console market would prefer to avoid this graphical eyesore. So unfortunately, you can't really find a middle ground between 30 and 60 when playing on a TV. You gotta just go for 60. Now there is some cool technology in development right now that I gotta talk about just briefly that's going to allow our displays, basically our computer monitors or TVs, to change their refresh rate to match the FPS of the game that we're playing or the content that we're watching. And this is going to avoid screen tearing, and it's going to allow us to have a frame rate that kind of fluctuates. Generally speaking, you don't want drastic fluctuations in your frame rate because there's latency associated with frames, and it'll kind of throw you off your game, especially if you're playing competitively. But at the higher frame rates, like say 70 plus, 80 plus, and you fluctuate a little bit, say 10 up or 10 down, it's not as big of a deal, but there will still be considerable screen tearing. So G-Sync and that kind of tech will be really good for high-end computer users. Not so much for the console market since they lock things in at 30 or 60. So what are the benefits of playing video games at faster frame rates? Why do gamers talk about this? Why is this such a hot topic with PC elitist culture where they talk about how fast their computers are and how many frames they can get while playing certain video games? Well, the first thing is that having more frames per second generally means that your video game is going to look a lot smoother. So aesthetically, you're going to see a lot of cool improvements. Performance-wise, you're getting less latency per frame and you're getting more visual information that's going to allow you to react quicker and sort of pick up more of the details that's going on in the environment around you, especially while you're on the move. Now, what do I mean by latency and getting less latency at higher frames per second? Well, if you think about it and you actually slow down 30 frames per second video, you can actually look at the individual frame, and the human eye has got one frame to work with every 33.3 milliseconds. So whatever's happening in those 33.3 milliseconds, you're not going to know until the next frame comes on screen. If you want to slow this down even further, you could say, in theory, if you're playing a video game at 1 frame per second, there's a lot that could happen in that second that you're not going to see until second number 2 and then second number 3, giving you very little information and time to react to it. Now, if you're gaming at 60 frames per second, you actually have a 16.6 millisecond delay at maximum. So this is going to be much better than the 33.3 millisecond delay you will get at 30 FPS. Now, again, if you continue to double that, you can get that down to around 8 millisecond delay at 120 frames per second. This is actually just going to literally improve your reaction time. Just like the ping that you see while joining a game of Battlefield, you bring up the scoreboard and it says, oh, you're playing at a 60 millisecond ping. Well, you also got to add on to that your millisecond delay that you could get from the frames that you're playing. There's a reason why competitive gamers are so crazy about frame rate. Now, when it comes to playing on a console, you have standardized hardware. So if you're playing on an Xbox One or a PlayStation 4, you're playing against opponents that have the exact same hardware. You're all playing at 30 frames per second, or you're all playing at 60 frames per second. There's no hardware advantage that you can get. There's none of that PC elitism wars going on. So in console gaming, is there really any reason to want 60 FPS over 30 FPS? Well, not from a competitive standpoint, purely because everybody's going to be playing on the exact same hardware. However, when looking at it from an aesthetic standpoint, 60 FPS is without a doubt just a better looking experience, a much more fluid experience. And so it would be really nice to see a lot of these modern next-gen consoles playing FPSs at 60 instead of 30. Sadly, the gaming industry has been making a lot of excuses lately for why they're not upgrading from 30 to 60 FPS. One of them is parity, where they're trying to create the same experience on old-gen consoles versus new-gen consoles. I don't agree with this thinking, but I guarantee you some marketing guy somewhere did the research and found out that if you say the experience is so much better on next-gen consoles versus old-gen consoles, you're going to sell a lot less copies on old-gen. So they're actually sacrificing the visual quality on next-gen consoles just to increase sales on old-gen. Another reason why console developers are sticking with 30 FPS is because they can increase the visual quality per frame considerably more. You actually do need twice the rendering power to play at 60 FPS versus 30. So rather than putting the rendering power into more frames, they're putting it into fancier visuals with better textures, reflections, and stuff like that. And where this benefits them is especially marketing and trailers. If you're watching a trailer for a video game on TV or on YouTube, well, those formats are actually capped at 30 frames per second. So if I show Destiny side by side with Battlefield 4 on my PC, you're not going to see a frame rate difference at all on YouTube because it just doesn't have the frame rate capacity to actually compare those two things. You can go to a few websites to actually see the comparisons, and I'll put a few of those links in the video description. Now that's kind of the basics of frame rates and gaming and where the industry is at right now. There's a lot more information out there, a lot of really interesting tests that have been conducted to actually show the improvements in reaction time at 60 FPS versus 30 FPS and other things like that, and I highly recommend reading up on some of these articles if you do want to know more. So overall, I hope this got everybody up to speed on the frame rate situation in video games and kind of explained my reason for wanting faster frame rates in some of the next gen games that are only available on consoles. As always guys, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. This is LevelCap signing off.